All right, everybody. I am Jamie Hamilton, a PhD candidate at Emory University. I'm part of the organizing committee on the ComSciCon-ATL group. We are super excited to have Maryn McKenna here, and we'll do a brief introduction. So, Maryn McKenna is an Atlanta-based independent journalist who specializes in public health, global health, and food policy. She's a senior fellow for the study of human health at Emory University. She's the author of the 2017 bestseller, Big Chicken: The Incredible Story of How Antibiotics Created Modern Agriculture and Changed the Way the World Eats, which received the 2018 Science and Society Award and was named the best book of 2017 by Amazon, the Smithsonian, Science News Wired, and Civil Eats. Her 2015 TED Talk, What Do We Do When Antibiotics Don't Work Anymore, has been viewed 1.8 million times and translated into 34 languages. She writes for the New York Times, National Geographic, NPR, the Smithsonian, Scientific American, and several other prominent publications. She has received the 2019 AAAS Colby Gold Award for magazine writing, the 2019 John P. McGovern Award for Excellence in Biomedical Communication, the 2014 Leadership Award for the Alliance of the Prudent Use. I apologize for my slip there, for the prudent use of antibiotics, and the 2013 Brian H. Walkman Award for Excellence in Public Communication of Life Sciences, among many, many other honors where I would lose my breath speaking on it. However, I would like to also include that she is a Poynter Fellow in Journalism at Yale University, as well as she received the, I believe it was the fellowship. She was a Knight Science Journalism Fellow at MIT. And we would like to thank her for coming and speaking with us and being our keynote speaker at the 2021 ComSciCon Atlanta.
Thanks. Thanks for that introduction. Hi, everybody virtually. It's really nice to meet you. For anyone who happens to watch Late Night with Seth Meyers, you may have seen my book, Big Chicken, last night because Seth interviewed Tony Fauci. And I opened up my Facebook this morning to find a screen grab from a friend. My book, Big Chicken, was on Fauci's shelf right next to his ear. It's the most exciting day of my life. So hi. So I'm Maryn, as you heard. Thanks, ComSciCon, for having me. Thanks, Jamie, for that great introduction and for being my contact for all this time as we've been figuring out what I was going to do today. I am thrilled to be here. I'm flattered to be asked. As the title said, I'm going to talk about science communication in the context of COVID and this crazy year we've had. But I want to make it clear from the start, for those of you who don't know me, that I'm coming to this from the communication side, not from the science side. I'm a journalist writing about science, involved with science, have a deep regard for science, but I didn't train as a scientist. My background is public health, and not really the science side of public health. Biostatistics broke me. So just so we know where we're starting from. So what a year, right? Today, March 18th, we are 1 year and 1 week from the day that the WHO declared COVID-19 to be a global pandemic. As of this morning, the global numbers were 121 million cases and, tragically, 2.6 million deaths around the world. Here in the United States, 29.6 million cases. That was as of this morning. It may well have gone up since, and 538,000 deaths, the worst national epidemic in numbers and also in rate of anywhere in the world. So I'm not especially proud of this, but I think I'm one of a small number of people who knew from the start that something significant was coming with COVID, though we didn't know what it was at the time. I happened to look close to midnight on December 30th, 2019 at the email list ProMedMail, which had just posted a notice from China about a small cluster of cases of atypical pneumonia. And I thought, oh, this is how SARS started in 2003, actually with a post on ProMedMail. I wonder if this is going to turn into something. And I admit, this is not what I expected, that this past year would be the most consequential public health crisis, not only of our lifetimes, but in more than a century. And I also didn't expect 15 months ago that this past year would turn out to be the most significant year for science communication that any of us can remember. That does not mean it was the best year. When I take stock, it feels as though we can see in this past year an entire syllabus of lessons that we can learn about communicating science. Some of the challenges that we faced in communicating science this past year, we got over. As of this morning, there were more than 113 million doses of vaccine administered in the United States. More than a fifth of the whole US population has been vaccinated, and that is a triumph. It's a triumph of drug development, it's a triumph of logistics, but it's also a triumph of communication. And we should give ourselves a moment to be proud of that, I think. But there are things that we failed at. And by we, I mean the whole community who communicates science, which includes journalists like me, science writers at universities and companies, public health officials, politicians, people who do community outreach, people who just want to share their love of science, and people who serve as nerd nodes for their personal networks. When I look back, it seems to me that there was so much that we failed to anticipate. Now, some of it we never could have imagined. For myself, as a public health journalist, a historian of public health, I have written about and over the years sat through a lot of planning for catastrophes, disease war games, projections of what could go wrong when an epidemic, an imagined epidemic, started. In all that planning, the one consideration that never appeared on anyone's list of possibles was that some of the top communicators in United States science would be silenced. That we would have a White House actively hostile to science, hostile enough to muffle the CDC, the world's premier public health agency, was literally unimaginable. And unfortunately, that turned out to be the case. And I think it's inarguable that not just our understanding of the pandemic, but the actual course of it, the case count and the death count, would have been different if the CDC had been allowed to speak and if the last administration had been as open to factual information as the new one, the Biden administration, seems to be. We should allow ourselves to grieve that. I think we should give ourselves space to acknowledge the illnesses and the deaths and the disrespect for evidence and the willingness of people to believe things because they want them to be true or because they're going to profit from them. And then we should figure out what went wrong in science communication in this past year so that we're prepared to go forward and do better. So let's draw up a little list. What are the challenges we faced last year? Let's start with the novel coronavirus being, well, novel. A pathogen that science had not identified before, public health had not dealt with before, that was new to the human population, and that, thanks to being a respiratory infection, possessing the ability to transmit asymptomatically, spread with incredible speed. It's hard to remember, I think, 15 months now into this, how quickly we climbed up the curve last year. Those first few cases that I reminded you about were announced just before midnight United States time on December 30th, 2019. In a little more than a month, on February 3rd, deaths worldwide topped 1,000. A month after that, on March 7th, the worldwide case count reached 100,000. A month after that, on April 2nd, the worldwide case count passed 1 million. It took until September to get to the first million deaths around the world. So that's astonishing speed and a brand new pathogen, and science had to keep up. So here's the first lesson. I don't think we prepared people for what it looks like when science is moving really, really fast. I think the average person has absorbed in their education or their own reading or being in the world that science changes its mind. That as new findings emerge, our understanding of the world changes. We changed our mind about the world being flat. We changed our mind about miasmas causing disease. And in the 20th century, we changed our mind several times about what constitutes a healthy diet. But I don't know if there's ever been a situation in which people could see science making new findings and contradicting itself almost every day. So we encouraged people to expect accuracy, but we failed to prepare them for uncertainty. You can see this most acutely, I think, in the ongoing conversation around wearing a mask. This time last year, really notable health authorities, then Surgeon General Jerome Adams, NIAID Director Dr. Tony Fauci, were urging people not to wear masks. That was partly out of concern that personal protective equipment was in short supply and that everyday people would buy surgical masks that healthcare workers ought to have. But it was also out of a lack of science having been done about the protectiveness of homemade masks and about concerns that people would contaminate themselves and infect themselves in the process of trying for protection. So over the summer, the science got done, and also the frame shifted as the scale of the emergency became clear and public health started to recommend homemade and mass market masks. And ever since, it has been a talking point for some opinion sectors that science cannot be trusted because it said one thing and then another. But you will all know that's what science does. It just doesn't normally do it in that short a span of time. And we failed to communicate that. Another thing that I think we didn't prepare our audience for is experiencing what it feels like when science talks to itself in public. The conversation in science about findings and methods used to take place in journals and letters to the editor in journals and in the hallways of conferences. And this past year, that conversation, again happening at great velocity, moved to preprint servers, lots of preprint servers, and to Twitter, where people disagreed, sometimes vociferously, and called each other names, and explained why each other was wrong in Twitter threads with dozens of posts in them, which branched and branched and branched as people responded to them. There was one day when it took me an entire day to put back together a single Twitter thread about a single finding. So let's be honest, some of this pre-peer review conversation was leveraged by researchers and also in some cases by companies to establish a narrative, to get results out there early enough that whatever they had to say would become the accepted view on a topic or a piece of research that would be hard to dislodge later. A lot of the early early discussion about vaccine results this past year didn't come via peer-reviewed papers. It came in preprints, and it came via company press releases released in advance of the data. If you go back to some of the news stories that were published on the mornings of the first days that vaccine results were released, you'll see that those stories are what we in journalism call single source stories. They only speak to one scientist or one entity, and that entity happens to be the vaccine manufacturer. It's probably not a coincidence that those stories were published just a few minutes before the stock market opened. So I think lately you can see on Twitter some researchers not even going as far as publishing a preprint. I have seen some discussion with eyebrows raised about things being a preprint, a preprint, like their manuscripts being sent around. In one recent case, someone complained about getting a manuscript that still had the track changes visible in it. As a writer, I really hate track changes. So this conversation in public, people contradicting and disagreeing with each other, not very politely, I think for the mass audience, this was very disorienting. And I think it created distrust. It seems to me that it made it very difficult for people who are not already immersed in science to understand where trustworthy information could be found. And I want to go a little deeper on the problem of science conducting itself on Twitter. I don't think we prepared people who are interested in science or who regularly consume news about science for the possibility that in this conversation about science, there could be bad actors. I don't mean here people pushing deliberate misinformation. I'll get to that problem in a minute. I mean the flattening of expertise that almost inevitably happens on social media. People have been talking about this on the internet for a couple of decades now. There's a famous New Yorker cartoon. I feel like I should show it to you because every scientific talk is supposed to have a New Yorker cartoon. But in the famous New Yorker cartoon, a dog is sitting at a computer and it says to another dog, on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. One of the hard things about doing talks like this is you can't hear people laughing or groaning or even see them rolling their eyes. But the problem of this flattening of expertise is that someone who's coming to a conversation and is naive to the topic doesn't look at the background of the people who are conducting it. Instead, what they look at is the intensity of their expression, with a kind of assumption that anyone who's being intense about something must have a stake in it, must care about the topic. Well, maybe, but they may not care about the topic because they actually care about the science. All through last year, we could see people inserting themselves into conversations about COVID who really had no standing to speak other than being a member of the public or being a member of a different scientific discipline. But they were labile enough or aggressive enough or eager enough to gain a public profile that they were able to use Twitter conversations to raise their personal profiles. In some ways, Twitter made room for a kind of cult of personality that created constituencies for particular points of view on different interventions around the virus, particular drugs and treatments, ivermectin, remdesivir, hydroxychloroquine, which was the drug that was pushed by the former administration and heavily by Fox News, to give them some credit, in addition to some scientists in Europe. So I don't want to call out particular names here because I don't want to contribute to the problem of buffing certain people's profiles, but also because there were not just one or two bad actors. This was a persistent problem, whether it was someone elevating one intervention or point of view on research over another, or one particular take on a scientific development. I think, to be brutal, we didn't prepare people for profiteering, for there being people on the internet who would use a tragic global situation for their personal benefit. So I said I wanted to talk about misinformation. And this is a big thorny topic. It includes disinformation, which is allied but separate. I'll separate those two in a minute. I think the challenge of misinformation and disinformation is going to be the problem within COVID that stays with us the longest, even after the pandemic is over, whether we eradicate this organism, which seems unlikely, or beat it back to a suppressed endemic state. So we've always known that there were people who didn't get science and who, in explaining it or passing on news, would just get things wrong. That may be the way a lot of people came to science communication, is that they wanted to correct bad information and they wanted to explain what they themselves found so exciting about what they were doing. And we've also always known that there would be people who would misrepresent science to serve a personal agenda, whether that's claiming vaccines cause autism, claiming that abortion causes breast cancer, or any one of a host of familiar representations. We could all run down a list. What I perceive we were not prepared for, and this is building on what I just said about velocity and about doing science in public, is the volume of misinformation. This is the first pandemic that really played out on social media. So SARS in 2003 occurred before the founding of Facebook or Twitter. The H1N1 avian flu pandemic in 2009, that was 3 years after the founding of Facebook and Twitter and 2 years after the first smartphone. But there wasn't really much of a constituency. The usage curve just wasn't that high at that point. Engagement is exponentially larger today. The Ebola epidemic of 2014 was undoubtedly affected by social media, but that was regional. It was regional in the information networks as much as it was regional in the size and the scope of the outbreak. But now there's today. And there happens to be a research group in Italy, the Bruno Kessler Foundation, that a year ago, January, so January 2020, right after things kicked off, started tracking misinformation on Twitter about COVID. And in March, a year ago, 2020, again, things are just getting started. The pandemic has just been declared. They identified an average of 46,000 Twitter posts a day that were linked to COVID-19 misinformation. So Of course, this is going to be worse now. I am not aware of a current measurement, but think of the millions and millions of people being exposed to conspiracy theories and false claims and hoaxes all day, every day. The World Health Organization subsequently called this problem an infodemic, a second pandemic along the actual one of disease. And I don't think we have adequately made clear to people that if they are having trouble finding reliable public health messages, it's not their fault. They're being deliberately frustrated in their desire to find trustworthy people to follow and trustworthy messages. And I don't think we've made clear to them either. I give us a bit of a break for this because this is a new concept for most of us. The degree to which some of this misinformation is actually disinformation. That it's not just your well-meaning aunt or your neighbor, a member of your church, passing along something they heard because they want to be helpful or they want to alert you. It's weaponized. It's meant to break social cohesion, to fuel political polarization, to turn societies against themselves, even in the past 6 months, to gain commercial advantage, because there's clear evidence now that several countries outside the US who are making vaccines, have vaccine plants and have state-sponsored plants and state-sponsored vaccine candidates are running disinformation campaigns against other countries' vaccines to make their vaccine candidate look better in the international marketplace and drive international sales or international donations that serve as a kind of form of soft diplomacy. So the final thing I want to say about the lessons I think we should learn from last year before we get to the good stuff is that I think we failed to appreciate that decisions about science are never only about science. I mean, the obvious example to this is the one about masks that I told you about, and the perception for masks, real or false, that they are an infringement on personal freedom. The less obvious, but I think more consequential frame that we can put around this is that when we asked for lockdowns all around the world to chill the transmission of the virus, we didn't fully process the economic impact of the lockdowns. And that has been a reasonable concern voiced back to health authorities about what stopping the virus has done to individual livelihoods. I mean, I live in Atlanta, I live in the Virginia Highland neighborhood, and that retail district now kind of looks like a jack-o'-lantern smile because of all the shops and restaurants that have shut down. It's really patchwork. It was pretty thriving 18 months ago. This is true not just for retail, it's even more true for the food service sector, the food production sector, all of the pieces of the economy that flow toward food service. And of course, it's even more true for performance, whether it's music performance or live theatrical performance. There aren't too many places in the country that have done a robust enough response like Tyler Perry has done on his personal movie property to bring people in, keep them safe, and keep producing content. In most places, most of the industry has been just shut down. So this question of how decisions about science are never only about science and that we have to understand the context. I think this is really important for the concern that we have about people being vaccine hesitant. Now, this is different from being anti-vaccine, which I kind of talked about before. There are people who are unalterably opposed to vaccine for a variety of reasons, but there's a much larger array of people who are concerned about a government-sponsored vaccination campaign for reasons that are very legitimate and that within their social or family or racial context or national origin make complete sense. Here are some examples. You will hear people talk about the Tuskegee study and how that permanently though it ended in the 1970s, how that permanently dented Black or African-American trust in the American healthcare system. That's true, but I am a little uncomfortable sometimes when we talk about Tuskegee not because it was not a horror, because it was an enormous shame to public health, but because when we talk about Tuskegee, it's as though there was only one bad study. And what we fail to appreciate is that the engagement of the American health and healthcare system with African American and Blacks in the United States has been shameful for a long time. Anyone who lives in Atlanta who's old enough, not me, but I have been told this story, will remember that there used to be downtown what they called the two Gradys. So Grady Memorial Hospital, the big public hospital in Atlanta, used to be divided down the middle. You entered through the main door and you turned one way to go to the white Grady and another way to go to the black Grady. A healthcare system that, while caring for the disenfranchised in a city, maintains a hospital shaped in that way, has a lot more to answer for than one terrible study. And it's reasonable, as a result, for the Black and African American community to be suspicious of government-sponsored vaccination campaigns and to have to be spoken to in their own context. And this is not only true for African Americans and Blacks. If you are Latinx and your family origin is up through Central or South America or Mexico, if you've had undocumented people in your family, you're going to be very concerned about a vaccination campaign that asks you to sign into a government-run national registry. If your origin is Caribbean, you are probably going to know about the Guatemalan syphilis study, in which syphilis was actually given deliberately to soldiers and to sex workers and then allowed to unfold. Or you might know about the way that early oral contraceptives were tested on women in Caribbean nations. If you're from sub-Saharan Africa, you might know about the Trovan trial, which was the basis for the movie The Constant Gardener. There are all kinds of reasons for minority groups, for groups of different national origins, for groups within the United States to be suspicious of vaccine when we advance vaccine as only a scientific or only a public health good. And I don't think we fully process that when we started out of the COVID pandemic to talk about mounting the vaccination campaign. So those are all the lessons I think we can extract from this past year. What I want to do now is turn a bit and talk about what are the things that we do well, and how do we take those lessons and do science communication better. The first thing I think we should, if not glory in, we should at least take note of, is that there would not have been this much engagement with COVID, with the vaccination campaign, with the problems around masks, with the discussion around whether lockdown was a good idea, if people didn't care, if they were not engaged. This is a topic that people profoundly cared about, and they should have. That gives us a toehold. So what then is our path through understanding that people pay attention to this, that people care about this, but we have insufficiently prepared them for the challenges that they faced in understanding this? I think the first is that we should understand that the frames we put around things may be off. Even though we all should have learned this by now, we still kind of stick to a deficit model of science communication, which is a format or a concept that proposes that people just don't have enough information. And if we give them the right information, then they will change their minds. And we ought to know by now that that by itself doesn't work, because how many people in the world still smoke? Everyone in the world knows that smoking is bad for you. There is not a single person born in the world today who has not seen, even on their own packs of cigarettes, a big box that says smoking kills. If having information that smoking is bad for you was enough to stop people smoking, the tobacco companies would have collapsed 30 years ago. That is not the case. Just facts do not do enough for us. And partisanship, I think we can see in this past year, also doesn't do enough for us. When we take the position that we, whoever we are, whether it's science, whether it's Democrats, whether it's any way you want to stratify society, that they have the right answers and the other side is wrong, that is not actually a clear pathway to communication. We should know that by now. So So facts by themselves, being accurate doesn't work. Being righteous doesn't work. Blaming people certainly doesn't work, which is a personal disappointment to me because there are people out there that I really would like to blame for some of the things that went on this past year. I struggle against that temptation every day. So what works? What works is storytelling. What works is describing what we are talking about out of a personal frame. One of the most thrilling things to me about, let's say, the second quarter of the pandemic, so starting last summer, after the first emergency in New York City had abated a little bit, and after the virus was moving across the country, was that you could see on Twitter that there were people, mostly healthcare workers, because that's where the nexus of the pandemic was at that point, was mostly in healthcare, writing long Twitter threads, sometimes every night, sometimes once a week, describing their personal experience of being in the hospital, caring for people, how frustrated they were, how grieved they were when they lost patients, how scared they were for themselves and their families. Some examples are Craig Spencer in New York City, who was one of the medics who was infected with Ebola in 2014 and came back to the United States and recovered. Dr. Bob Wachter in LA, a longtime healthcare economist. And here in Atlanta, Dr. Kimberly Manning at Grady, who writes gorgeous Twitter essays of many, many posts about engaging with her patients, mostly elderly patients at Grady. Lately, she's been writing about her encounters with trying to convince people that the vaccine is worth taking, and it just breaks my heart every time I read them. Outside of Twitter, you can see similar things in similar essays written more sort of in block text form on sites like Medium, on people's personal sites. You can see it in Instagram. You can see it even in TikToks. And I love that the personal storytelling around the pandemic has moved to other forms of narrative than just the text of posts and Twitter posts and so forth, because it gives us so many different entry points to the concerns of different people. But what this personal storytelling does is it doesn't sacrifice the scientific concerns, and it doesn't sacrifice the public health points, but it wraps it in a frame of personal concern and personal engagement. So the first thing that the person who may be hesitant or may be uncertain about something they ought to know or may have received bad information, they enter into relationship with the person speaking before they encounter the scientific facts. I find that just incredibly moving. And also, as someone who is a communicator, a really great strategy, because no one can tell you you're wrong if what you're relating is your personal feelings. And if you open the door with the personal encounter and then hit people with the scientific facts, it seems to me that it's much more strategically successful than banging them over the head with the facts to start with. So another thing that storytelling does is that it shifts us out of all those frames that were so unsuccessful. Not just the frame of, well, I am accurate and you are wrong, but also the frame of partisanship. Because what storytelling does is it erases opposition. It also gives us an opportunity in storytelling to honor community knowledge. So whatever those communities who are vaccine hesitant or feel separated from the mainstream or feel distrustful of American healthcare, whatever they are feeling, whatever their community or personal history is that causes them to feel that way, coaxing them into storytelling gives us a way to ventilate those feelings, to make them public, to give them some respect in a way that just saying, your community believes this and they are wrong, is really not going to do. The final thing I want to say is that there's an aspect of personal agency to storytelling that you can see in a whole number of other things that happened during the pandemic. As much as there was a comprehensive failure on the part of the top level of the American public health response. And I know that I am sitting here in Atlanta, 2 miles from the CDC, and there are CDC people who are my friends and neighbors. They know that they were silenced, and I think they felt a lot of anguish about it. But the reality is The White House, HHS, the CDC did not do what they could. But there were extraordinary volunteer efforts that came up all around the United States, all science-based, to help step into the gap caused by the absence of those official structures. The COVID tracking project, which just shut down, was started by a couple of journalists at the Atlantic Monthly and then expanded to a massive volunteer effort that was the single best source for statistics about the pandemic for almost all of last year. They just shut down because basically the CDC came back and the CDC can handle it now. There's another organization, COVID Exit Strategies. There's a group at Georgia Tech that mapped people's risk down to zip code for the size of public gathering they went to. There's a database that was put up by the Federation of American Scientists that offered people answers to their something like 100 most common questions about COVID. There's a sort of an advice column run by a science communicator called Dear Pandemic. All of these were done by people, not out of any professional obligation, but out of a personal obligation, out of feeling of a personal need to address the chaos and in many cases the anguish of the pandemic, and feeling that out of whatever their engagement with science and public health was, that they could offer something that would make a difference. And I think this is what this really comes down to, and this is where I'll wrap up, and then if anybody has questions, we can talk, is that as I look back over these past 15 months, I feel we all of us who are science communicators fell into a lot of traps. We made significant mistakes. We have good reasons for having made those mistakes, and I think we can learn good lessons for them. But I think the impulse that causes us to want to be science communicators in the first place, whether it's intoxication with the complexity of science, or joy in the precision of doing an experiment, or hope that the results of science can make a difference, that sense rising up out of each of us personally of wanting to tell a story that makes a difference in the world, that's our golden thread. That's what we should be following. And that's what I think will lead us into doing it better next time. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Maryn, for that wonderful talk. Everybody clap, and the clapping emojis. Thank you, everyone, so much. Okay, are there any questions in the chat? Don't see any questions in the chat.
I wasn't watching the chat.
No questions in the chat. Okay, well, I have one question to get it rolling while people think of questions. You talked about the infodemic, and it feels as though, given what you talked about, that you believe that the vaccine could be storytelling. Now, we know that the platform Twitter has a little bit of a problem when it comes to actually, verifying the identities, because I'm sure those 46,000 tweets a day that we're talking about, not all of those were potentially real people, quote unquote, right? So my question to you is, how do we potentially bring back a little bit of expertise in the context of social media and really try to utilize the vaccine of storytelling to fight the infodemic? I know it's a long question.
No, that's great. That's absolutely great. So a thing that I didn't think about, I didn't talk about, but I should have. So thanks for giving me a chance to say this is, as much as I am talking about how we did things wrong, the public are not passive consumers. And I think one of the things I hope we can do going forward is kind of come to a sort of mutual agreement about what all our responsibilities are. I think one of the things that the WHO asks for is that sort of as people, they sort of propose a protocol for engaging with the infodemic. And one of those is basically just like a chill switch. Like you see something on social media or someone tells you something and you think it's really important and you don't stop to check your sources, right? And so maybe if everybody could just like take a breath before punching send, then we might reduce the intensity a little bit. I think similarly, I really think I think it's on us to kind of try to train the public on what a trustworthy source looks like. And by us, I mean, this is up to me as a journalist, as well as up to people who are speaking from within science. It's not just that that we should be asking. I'm going to make up a hypothetical here. If we want to talk about the spread of disease, we should be asking an epidemiologist and not a surgeon, let alone not the guy that like stayed in a Holiday Inn last night or whatever that meme is. But we should be sure to ask the right kind of epidemiologist, right? Like it should be an infectious disease epidemiologist. If I want to talk about zoonotic spillover, I want to be asking a wildlife biologist. And I think it would be great if all of us who are in science in some way made clear in our Twitter bios, for instance, who we are, like what our degrees are. A lot of women do that on Twitter now, pretty much as more as an insistence on an equivalent degree of respect. They will have doctor in their Twitter handles. But it would be good to, have your Twitter bio not just be fanciful, not just be like, as mine used to say something like collector of foreign condiments. And it occurred to me, maybe it would really be more useful to say, well, I'm a journalist who writes about infectious disease, so people will actually know what I'm here for. But I think we really need to help people understand that all those letters after people's names are there for a reason, and they're not just proof that people went through grueling years of schooling. They're also a sort of a badge of authenticity, and we should look for those.
I completely agree. We do have a question in the chat from William Katzman. Is this a storytelling war then of telling of anecdotal stories of people dying from vaccines versus those saved?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, there are all these urban legends circulating around the vaccines now, right? Sometimes they are simply urban legends. They don't, those people don't, some people, in some cases, in some of the stories, those people don't exist. And that may be on people like me, journalists. So when we are presented with a story about an anecdote, let's say, about, someone took a disease and then, took a vaccine and then dropped dead, which is a version of the one you hear every year about, oh, I took the flu shot and then I got the flu, to actually track down if those people exist. But I think we also, one of the things I would like to see us work harder on, all of us, is to help our audience understand evidentiary rigor, so that we sort out for them correlation versus causation, and that we sort out for them scale. There's a conversation happening right now in Europe about whether there are clotting difficulties linked to receiving the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine specifically. Now, just in the past day, I've seen an indication that there may actually be a mechanism underlying that, but that's still very hypothetical. But it may be simply, correlative. It may just be that there's a certain percentage, especially in elderly people, that may be vulnerable to clotting events that happens to be coincident with their getting the vaccine, since older people are being vaccinated in those countries, but not actually any causation at all. We sort of, all of us, because we've heard this so many times, right? We all kind of prattle about correlations and causation, but we very often don't really take the time to explain to people what that means. So it's probably on us to do, again, a bit more storytelling, but storytelling with rigor. In order to make clear why we think these accounts need to be examined very carefully. I think there's a follow-up.
Yes.
Yeah, some are coincidental, true stories. Yeah, right, exactly. So in the case of the AstraZeneca clotting maybe connection, those people really do have clots, right? I don't think those are made up. It's not like the fake dead people. But they may not be fake dead people, because in fact people do die, but people do, a certain percentage of people in a certain physical condition at a certain age may be getting DVTs, and they may have received the vaccine, but that doesn't mean that the vaccine caused it. I think we just have to be clear about that.
One more question from Melissa Mulho. I'm sorry, Maryn.
Yeah, for people who are interested in science journalism, where can they start? Well, I presume that means practicing science journalism as opposed to just reading science journalism. Melissa, if you're still there, you can type in a
Yes.
clarification if you want. Oh, there's Melissa. Hi, Melissa.
Here, hi. Yeah, just like, where to start, like for like writing specifically. reading it would be cool as well. So
So, well, if people are Emory students, they can take my course. I teach science writing at Emory. So, I mean, there are a couple of different ways of being a science journalist. One is you actually go to school for it. People go for undergraduate degrees or master's degrees in science journalism. I have a master's in science journalism. My undergrad degree, deep breath, is in 16th century theater and 20th century poetry. And scientific audiences usually laugh at that point. So it's okay if everybody giggles. I really won't mind much. But the other way is just to do it. I mean, this is a little out of date these days. This is going to make me kind of show my age, but 10 years ago or more, the way that a lot of people got into science or opened a door to science journalism was to start blogging about science. They decided they wanted to teach themselves to be science writers. They read a lot of popular science writing. They would every week pick out a new paper and sort of write a précis of that paper, or try to turn it into a little, not a story exactly, but in the sense of with quotes and extra research and stuff, but a little essay, and then post it on a blog. There are still people on the Emory faculty who do that. They're not beginning to be science journalists, but they're practicing, they're doing their science writing in public. Their popular science writing in public by blogging. I think that Anthony Martin, who teaches evolution, still does that. And Cassandra Quave, who is an ethnobotanist, does that. She's amazing. Yeah, so I guess those are the two doors. Is one is you train, and the other is you practice. And eventually, if you're fortunate and things line up, then you kind of get to bring them together into a job. So there's a question here about public scientific discourse. So these are, do you want me to read these out? Can everybody, I don't know if everybody can see these or not.
Yes, everyone can see them.
Okay, fine.
Yes.
Okay, so this is Elizabeth, I'm sorry, Sajewski. I apologize if I'm saying that wrong. If Elizabeth, if you're there and you want to tell me how to pronounce your name, that would be kind.
I could ask my question really quickly if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
So it's Sayefki, but that was a good attempt. Yeah, so I was just thinking about scientific discourse and having public scientific discourse, and the great benefit as a epidemiologist and a scientist that I got from kind of epi Twitter and science Twitter while kind of researching COVID-19. And I was wondering how we kind of balance this benefit from kind of creating this really great public community of scientists versus having all of that out there for the public to see, because there's going to be disagreements and there's going to be teams with different viewpoints. So how we balance that or mediate that or help educate the public so that they can consume that in a way that's not confusing.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really hard question, and I don't know what the answer is. I actually saw some people, I wish I could remember who said it, about a week ago, a couple of female scientists engaging in a thread in which they pretty much said, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not going to debate new findings on Twitter anymore, because the number of people who are coming into my threads telling me that I've got it wrong, they're not only is it personally unpleasant, but it's polluting the science for me. So I need to they were talking about finding another, she and several other scientists were talking about finding some sort of more walled garden to talk in. So I don't know, maybe that means everybody migrates to Slack or Clubhouse, although Clubhouse is kind of semi-public now and also is weird. I just find Clubhouse weird. But let's say you're going to stay in the Agora, right? You're going to stay out in public. What is that? What do you do? It's hard, and it's harder. I don't pretend it's easy for anyone, but I think it's harder for women scientists than it is for men, because women scientists come in for a degree of vitriol on Twitter that it just doesn't, to my eyes. What I have seen directed at male scientists, though it can be really aggressive, pales in comparison to what women scientists get. There's only in any one post, there's only so many characters. So how much of a post do you spend saying this is preliminary? I'm I'm just advancing this as an idea, before you lose enough room to actually talk about your stuff. I kind of think I have no solutions, but I think this is a problem that is being discussed out loud right now. How do you do those two things? And I don't think people are going to end up in the same place. how we do. Anybody else? Any more questions? Did I not talk enough, guys? I can talk more.
Any more questions?
I have a question. One, I guess you might call it a covariate, something that has had influence on this whole COVID-19 discussion is age, whether it's the age of scientists, younger populations on Twitter versus the older, more established, and the seniority or the credibility that's associated with age. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the role that that has played in science communication of COVID.
Give me a little bit more so that I understand. I'm not sure I understand the question.
I would expect that many of my family members would probably be more likely to trust me if I had more experience or if I had my doctorate as opposed to being on my way to the doctorate because of the credibility that those letters hold, or maybe trusting the Anthony Fauci's of the world as opposed to a local epidemiologist just because he has a title or rank or is older or has been around the block more. And how that can play, whether or not into COVID, but just as graduate students trying to spread information about COVID or our research and versus more senior people in the field.
Well, you could try having a fake avatar. Gray hair and sorry, that's ageist of me. That is an interesting question. And I don't know what the answer is, but it is I'll sort of slide sideways analogically here that, there are some people on who are like in the COVID discourse on Twitter who are surprisingly young. Like there's a guy who started a COVID, a dashboard. I'm going to blank on what it is now. It might've been a dashboard related to vaccination. His name is Benji Renton. He's a college senior. And he, his work is good. He's at Middlebury, I think. His work is great. But he just like showed up and started this, and people engage with him like he's, a full adult. Not that he isn't, because he is a college senior, so he's probably over 20. But he's not, he's not in his 30s. So I don't know how to slice or maybe how to stratify the credibility question, how much it's age and how much it's gender and how much it's appearance. I think all of those go into the internet, the public internet, just sometimes being a tough place for people. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not really giving you an answer because I don't know what the answer is, but I acknowledge that it's a problem.
It's a complex issue. It's definitely a complex issue. So,
someone has science museums more trusted than scientists, which seems to suggest that local community connections are more trusted than distant government entities. That might be true. So, I don't know what you do with that because science museums don't have a ton of funding. And part of the degree to which you can do outreach is, some people do outreach just again because they love it. But once you actually have a building that you need to pay the heating bill on, your ability to do outreach is limited by the funds you get to like pay your staff and keep the lights on. But it's interesting that imagining a science museum as a node is kind of like. It's sort of scaling up from imagining a person as the writer Emily Willingham, who happens to be a friend of mine, Emily Willingham, PhD, who happens to be a friend of mine, she coined a phrase, it's more than 10 years ago now, about people being nerd nodes for their personal networks, being the person to whom your parents or your cousins or the people at a party or something like that come to and say, I don't really quite understand this efficacy versus effectiveness thing. Could you explain this to me? And you always explain. I am the nerd node for my network. I am not embarrassed to say. And so that's local, right? That's inherently local because it's your personal network. So maybe if you imagine scaling up from whatever happens in your personal network, maybe it's your church, maybe it's your museum, maybe it's your community health center. It kind of depends. Again, this is context dependent. But the idea that authority maybe can be gained and distributed locally, whatever we determine, whatever we define local as, is a really intriguing one. And it might solve some of that if we start to think of authority as being networked in that manner. It might solve some of this problem of not trusting the government, because the government is the government and it's up there, and up there is inherently bad. So thanks for raising that possibility, William. How can we restrain physicists? That is a very interesting question. I have no idea how we restrain physicists. But yeah, I mean, but this is an example of what I was talking about, right? Is that people rush in, even if they're, and it might be out of enthusiasm, or it might be out of a desire for attention. It might be because they really think they're helping. People rush in and they're not really speaking out of their expertise, but they're speaking because they think they inherently are experts on everything. And we just have to be careful of that. We can't stop people from speaking. Of course, we can't stop people from speaking, but we can keep from amplifying them, including, just like replying to them. Because even if the science is pretty clear that when you're trying to debunk things, if you repeat them in order to debunk them, you are defeating the purpose of calling it out in the first place, because no matter what you say, you've pushed it along into greater attention. So just like shut them down. So yeah, maybe just a dignified silence in response to people like that is the best approach. A mute button, block list, something like that. What do you think? Have we run out of questions? Are we good?
I have one more question, and then we'll let you go, I believe. But we have, you have a very storied career as a journalist, and so I really wanted to know, what really pulled you into wanting to become a storyteller, and like, what were some of the, if there, I don't, that our lives are made up of a series of events, that create the person we are today. So what was one of those events that really lit your spark?
So that's the long version of, thank you for asking the question. The long version of this you can actually find on a webpage that was just put up by an amazingly great site called the Open Notebook, which is a nonprofit that was started by two science journalists, basically to be the sort of like peer-to-peer self-help site that we all needed and that didn't exist. It's 10 years old this year, or maybe 10 years old last year. And they recently put up a collection of essentially origin stories for science writers and science journalists. It's flagged on a tab on the site, and I am in there. So the short version is, as I told you guys, my undergraduate degree is in literature and theater, and that was what I really thought I wanted to do with my life. And it became pretty clear after I got my undergraduate degree that if I tried to do that, I would starve. So I went off to journalism school thinking I would just be some kind of writer. And I ended up in the very practical short master's course I went to, master's degree program I went to, really kind of falling in love with newspaper journalism, which was not in the plan at all. So I went off to be a newspaper journalist. And fairly quickly, I got asked to join an investigation being run at the Cincinnati Enquirer of weird cancer clusters occurring around the site of a closed federal plant that had been part of the chain of plants that created the nuclear weapons that ended World War II. So this was a plant fairly early in the chain. They used to they'd put something on the weapon and then they'd put it on a train and they'd send it somewhere else. And these trains went all the way across the country and back. The idea being that manufacturing was distributed so that no one place could be destroyed if the country was bombed. So everyone who had these weird cancers also had every single possible confounder for developing cancer. They were of low socioeconomic status. They lived in an underserved rural area. Their diets were terrible. Most of them hadn't finished high school. They smoked, on and on and on. And so untangling what actually would have caused their cancers, cancer clusters are notoriously hard to prove. Was it something in their genetics or their personal responsibility, or pollution leaking from this nuclear plant? Was a really thorny problem. Nevertheless, my and I knew nothing about epidemiology at that point. I had actually come out of doing financial investigations for my first 2 years out in the job market. But encountering the tangled epidemiology of that was just super intoxicating to me. And so that kind of was what I started doing. We actually ended up, we, the newspaper, helped those people win a nuclear harm lawsuit against the government, which was very validating. But I went on to do other epidemiology-based investigations. I eventually came here to Atlanta the first time I lived here to work for the Journal-Constitution covering the CDC. And then I went off and started writing books and doing magazine work. But to loop this back, the thing that made this all storytelling to me was that in the stories I was discovering in these epidemiologic investigations, I'm kind of weirdly passionate about sort of plots and the shapes of stories. And I could see the same base, like the same underlying stories in these investigations that I had seen like in theater and in reading literature, which was things like, you know, there are plots that are shared across cultures. An orphan discovers that he's a prince, right? A girl disguises herself to go to war and defend her family. Children wander into the forest and discover a monster. The monster is actually under the bed. It's inside the house. So there were those epidemiologic investigations, disease detection it's kind of a monster story. And it's also a detective story, which is like, if you think of however many iterations of Sherlock Holmes there have been over the past 140 or so years since Sherlock Holmes was still written, maybe it's 120 years. No, it's probably 140. You know, there have been hundreds. I mean, there's still Sherlocks on television, right? That's the power of the detective story as a plot. And disease outbreak investigations are detective stories. And I just couldn't get enough.
Thank you very much. That was a riveting story, and I look forward to going on the open notebook. I believe some posted.
Yeah, please do. They're amazing.
Wonderful.
Okay, so it was super fun to talk to everybody. I wish you guys good luck with the rest of the con. Did you want me to like connect anywhere else after this? Am I supposed to connect with another group, or am I just going to hang up?
We're going to go ahead and stop the live stream now.
Okay.
And then kind of pause for a moment, and then we will begin a more